Get out, you poor unemployed loser. At my middle school reunion after 30 years, a classmate named Jim, now an executive at a top company, greeted me with his usual disdain. Here we go again. Jim's condescending attitude towards me wasn't new. He had always looked down on me, calling me poor since we were kids. However, this reunion was something our classmates had been looking forward to. I didn't want Jim to ruin it for everyone. I couldn't let him continue to have his way. As I stood there thinking this, it turned out that Jim would get what he deserved, proving that what goes around comes around. My name is John, and I'm 60 years old. I currently live with my wife in the suburbs. Our 2 children have grown up and started families of their own. My work and personal life are fulfilling, and I enjoy every day. But things weren't always this good. The younger me would be shocked to see how my life turned out. 45 years ago, I was at rock bottom. My parents died when I was young, and I was raised in a foster home. I went to elementary school from the foster home. My classmates often teased me, calling me poor when they found out. I had no one to turn to and had to face it all alone. For a young child, that was incredibly tough. I remember crying in secret almost every day. Why don't I have a family? I wanted to live with a family like everyone else. I thought that many times. But I knew I had to live on my own. No matter how much I hated my circumstances, it wouldn't change anything. I decided I would become strong. With that resolve, I graduated from elementary school and entered middle school. To become stronger, I joined the martial arts club. I also worked hard at my studies. It was partly to avoid being looked down upon by my classmates. My efforts paid off, and I wasn't teased as much in middle school. I even made a best friend. His name was Steve. Thanks to him, I enjoyed my days. Time flew by, and soon we were in our final year of middle school. It was time to decide our future paths. Classmates with families naturally decided to go to high school, but me, being in a foster home, didn't have that option. I wanted to leave the foster home and live independently as soon as possible. John, if you don't know what you want to do, it's a good idea to go to high school. Ms. Davis from the foster home advised me. But I just couldn't see myself going to high school. Besides, I had something I wanted to try. I wasn't particularly good at studying, but I was good at cooking. Helping the staff cook at the foster home sparked my interest in cooking. Making delicious food made everyone smile. I was fascinated by the magic of cooking. After graduating middle school, I started working as an apprentice cook at a restaurant. Being a middle school graduate, I was often looked down on by my coworkers. But once I decided to do something, I was determined to give it my all. So, I did whatever I could. Even if it was just menial tasks. Over time, fewer people looked down on me for not having a high school diploma. In fact, the head chef, Tom, sometimes praised me, saying, "Lately, you've been full of enthusiasm and doing a great job." I wanted to keep working hard and eventually become a professional chef. That became my dream. But one day, I was thrown into despair. It's hard to say this, but due to the recession, we have to downsize. I'm sorry, but we have to let you go. No way. I was at a loss. This happened just when I was about to move on from my apprenticeship. Why did I always have to face such hardships? At that moment, all I could do was grieve. But I couldn't stay sad forever. I needed money to live. I started job hunting. However, as a middle school graduate with no career, it was tough to find a job. Just when I was starting to get desperate, I finally secured a new job. Shortly after starting at my new workplace, I received an invitation to a middle school reunion. It had been 15 years since we graduated. I wondered how my classmates were doing. Feeling a strong urge to see everyone, I decided to attend the reunion. At that time, I had completely forgotten about something. On the day of the reunion, I entered the venue to find it bustling with many classmates. I spotted Steve among them. I ran straight to him without hesitation. "Steve. Long time no see." My heart was racing with excitement at seeing my old friend again. Steve also looked happy. "It's been 5 years since we last met. It's great to see you looking well." Steve's smile was as reassuring as ever. Back in middle school, Steve and I were in the martial arts club together, working hard together. We did everything together and often talked about our problems. Steve and I started reminiscing about old times. Just then, I heard a familiar condescending voice from behind me. I'm the youngest department head at Culinary Goods Incorporated. Culinary Goods? That big company? Wow, Jim, that's impressive. This voice, it was Jim. Of course, he was a classmate from middle school. Until that moment, I had completely forgotten that Jim was a classmate back then. Or maybe I had tried to erase him from my memory. Jim had been that awful. It started on the first day of middle school. I lived on the boundary of the school district, so I ended up at a different middle school than my elementary school classmates. But Jim lived nearby and unfortunately attended the same middle school. He had been the main instigator in calling me poor and teasing me during elementary school. I resolved to avoid him as much as possible. But as soon as he saw me at the entrance ceremony, he started mocking me again. I can't stand being around a poor guy. Hey everyone, this guy's really poor. Let's stay away from him. Jim shouted loudly, making his voice echo in the hall where the entrance ceremony was held. I never thought Jim would go that far, so I was shocked. At the same time, a strong anger rose from the depths of my being. But without the courage to fight back, I stayed silent, and then he shouted again. Stay away from that poor kid from the foster home, or you'll end up poor too. Jim made sure everyone else could hear. I had hoped to make new friends and work hard in middle school, but because of Jim's words, the classmates around me scattered like cockroaches. I had reached my limit. At that moment, Steve and some other brave classmates spoke up for me. Hey! That's not okay. You can't choose your family. How would you feel if you were in his shoes? No one had ever raised their voice for me like that before. I was stunned by this sudden support. There were people who would stand up for me. I remember feeling overwhelmed with gratitude. Jim retorted to Steve, "What, are you poor too?" Birds of a feather flocked together. But Steve wasn't fazed at all. I thought Steve was incredibly cool. From that point on, Steve stayed by my side. We went through both happy and sad times together. After this incident, Jim stopped bothering me, and I was able to enjoy my middle school life. As Jim bragged about his job, Steve whispered in my ear, "Isn't Culinary Goods the company where Jim's dad is the president?" He's just riding on his dad's coattails. I see, that explains it. I decided to ignore Jim. I didn't need to talk to Jim at this fun reunion. That was my thought. Just then, a woman approached Steve and me. It was Lisa, who had been that girl in the class back in middle school. Long time no see. You two are still as close as ever. Even at 30, Lisa's beauty hadn't faded. Her smile was radiant. I couldn't help but be captivated. Steve, Lisa, and I reminisced about old times. Then Jim came over to us. Hey! Poor duo. Lisa, you should get away from these guys. Poor duo. How rude he is. Steve and I fell silent. But Lisa, with a scowl, raised her voice. Why do you say such things? We're 30 now, grow up. Jim was visibly annoyed by Lisa's words. He was clearly hurt by what Lisa said. Jim got frustrated and turned his anger towards me. You guys haven't changed a bit. I heard you got fired, John. If you want, I can get you a job as a janitor at my company. Jim spoke with a smug look on his face. I didn't need a job from Jim. Especially not at his company. I sighed deeply. No, I'm good. I've already got a new job. Jim looked surprised as he stared at me. Why did I have to be looked down on by Jim so much? My old anger toward Jim resurfaced. Steve seemed to notice my change in demeanor and pulled me aside. John, let's go grab some food over there. But Jim followed us, continuing to talk. If he despised us so much, why didn't he just leave us alone? My mind was clouded with frustration. Then Jim said something unforgivable. Hey Steve, I heard your dad's company finally went bankrupt. Now you're officially poor. Must be tough having a loser for a dad. Jim insulted Steve's father right in front of us. Steve's face turned red with anger. The next moment, he shouted. You don't know anything, so stop bad-mouthing my dad. It was the first time I'd heard Steve raise his voice like that since the entrance ceremony in middle school. Our classmates around us turned to see what was happening. But Jim just laughed unrepentantly. Did you get hurt by the truth? I only speak facts. If you don't like it, make as much money as I do and stop being poor. I was filled with disbelief. How could he say such things to a classmate? Overwhelmed with anger, my body started to tremble. Unable to stay there any longer, Steve and I hurriedly left the venue. Outside, Steve looked at me apologetically and said, "Sorry for yelling like that." Steve had nothing to apologize for. "Steve, it's not your fault. That was just too much." As I began to express my anger, Steve told me his situation. "It's true that my dad's company went bankrupt. So, it's no wonder Jim said that." Steve looked down as he spoke. Steve's father had run a small factory, and Jim had mocked him for it since middle school, saying it was going to fail. Steve had tried to ignore it, but this time he couldn't hold back. I put my hand on Steve's shoulder. "Don't waste your time getting angry at him. He's a terrible person. Let's go get a drink and cheer up." Steve seemed to brighten a bit at my words. And we ended up having a meaningful time together. I thought I would never attend another reunion if it meant seeing Jim again. That was my thought. 30 years passed quickly. I was now 60. Compared to when I was younger, my legs and back had weakened, and I could feel my body aging. So, this is what it feels like to be 60. As I thought this over breakfast, my phone rang. Who could be calling this early? It was a call from Steve. "There's a middle school reunion coming up. Are you going to join us, John?" I hesitated for a moment. A middle school reunion meant Jim might be there too. I didn't want to endure his jabs like 30 years ago. Sensing my hesitation, Steve added, "Jim can't make it this time, so don't worry." "Jim won't be there? In that case, I'd like to go." So, I told Steve that I would attend. I wanted to see my old classmates and reminisce about the past. I eagerly awaited the day, looking forward to reuniting with everyone. On the day of the reunion, I walked into the restaurant excitedly. The venue, the largest restaurant in town, had been booked exclusively for this reunion. As I entered, I saw a grand chandelier. There was a spread of delicious-looking food and a wide variety of drinks. My classmates were already there, holding wine glasses and sharing stories from the old days. I quickly grabbed a drink and made my way to join them. Just then, someone called out to me, and I turned around to see Steve standing behind me. Steve smiled at me. "Steve, I heard you retired yesterday. Congratulations on your retirement." I greeted him with these words of appreciation. Steve had retired from his job of 30 years just the day before. "Thanks. We've reached the age of retirement, haven't we? Are you still working, John?" "Yeah, I'll keep at it for a while longer. I'd get bored just staying at home." Steve and I enjoyed a pleasant conversation over drinks. Then the restaurant door opened. At that moment, Steve and I froze. "What?" I couldn't help but let out a gasp. Jim, who said he couldn't make it, had walked into the restaurant. I never expected to see him again. I didn't want trouble anymore. Steve and I decided to keep our distance from Jim. But Jim spotted us and started walking toward us. Reflexively, Steve and I stepped back. Jim greeted us with, "Well, you two have really become old men." What was he talking about? He's the same age as us, so he's an old man too. I bit back the retort that was on the tip of my tongue. "Jim, weren't you supposed to have another plan?" I asked, and Jim looked smug. "I had a meeting with Summit Enterprises today, but I left it to my subordinates." Those guys at Summit Enterprises always have long discussions. A classmate listening nearby looked surprised. Summit Enterprises? That famous company? Impressive, Jim. Hearing this, Jim's face lit up even more. "Yeah, this restaurant is also owned by Summit Enterprises. But those guys are always so arrogant. Summit Enterprises owes everything to culinary goods, so they should show a little gratitude." Jim laughed as he said this. Steve and I exchanged wry smiles. "By the way, I heard you retired, Steve. It's nice that people at small companies can retire so easily. I can't retire yet because I'm an executive. In a few years, I'll be the president. Meanwhile, Steve, you'll probably live off the taxes I pay. Jim looked down on us just as he did 30 years ago. Steve was too stunned to respond. But I was no longer the same person I was 30 years ago. Hey, that's enough. What's wrong with retiring? If you're going to keep looking down on people, you should leave this place. Hearing this, Jim's face turned red. He hadn't expected me to say that. Shut up. Get out, you poor unemployed loser. Unemployed? Oh, he's talking about something that happened over 30 years ago. I couldn't help but laugh. Just then, Steve, with a pale face, said, "What are you talking about? Who do you think you're talking to? If anyone should leave, it's you." Jim's eyes widened in surprise. Huh? What are you talking about? I'm an executive at Culinary Goods. Clearly, you guys are the ones who should leave. At that moment, the waiter, Mike, approached me. "Mr. Smith, when should we serve the cake?" What? The room fell silent instantly. Jim looked at me in disbelief. Could you wait a bit longer? I said that and Mike nodded yes and left. Why Mr. Smith? Why is he asking you permission? Jim demanded. I didn't want to talk to Jim any longer, so I stayed silent. Then Steve spoke up for me. John owns this restaurant. I asked him to reserve it for our reunion. What? So John is the president of Summit Enterprises? Jim's face turned pale. Yes, that's right. So if anyone should leave, it's you. Steve's words left Jim speechless. Our classmates, who had been listening, quickly gathered around me. John, that's amazing. Why didn't you tell us? They all praised me. I didn't think it was necessary. We're here to enjoy ourselves, not to talk about our jobs. I said, and they all nodded yes in agreement. But Jim was not satisfied. There's no way a high school dropout like you could be the president of such a big company. You must be someone's replacement or something. How rude. I couldn't hold back any longer. I founded Summit Enterprises. Jim was stunned. Yes, I had indeed started Summit Enterprises. Many people are surprised when they hear I didn't graduate high school. But me being the president is an undeniable fact. When I was laid off and couldn't find a new job, I felt hopeless. I thought I had no skills as a middle school graduate. But there was one thing I was proud of. That was cooking. Since my time in the foster home, I had made all kinds of dishes, and I continued to work with food even at the restaurant where I was laid off. I knew I could still work in this industry. I was confident about it. However, there wasn't a restaurant I wanted to work for. So I decided to create my own. I saved money by working part-time and started this restaurant. It began as a single establishment, but now there are dozens of locations nationwide. We even have a large corporate building, and we're now one of the top revenue-generating companies in the industry. The early days were tough, but perseverance paid off. Jim stood there, speechless. I was trembling with anger at Jim's rudeness. Then, a gentle voice came from behind me. Are you okay? Lisa looked at me with concern. She must have noticed something was off with me. Should we go home? She said, taking my hand. Seeing this, Jim was dumbfounded. Wait, Lisa and John, are you too? We've been married for 30 years. Jim couldn't hide his shock and staggered. He never expected that the person he had mocked as poor would marry the it girl in the class. Married? That can't be true. Our classmates looked at Jim in surprise. Didn't you know, Jim? They're famous for being a perfect couple. Jim just stared at me in disbelief. Yes, my wife is Lisa, the class beauty from middle school. Lisa and I had no connection during middle school, but we reconnected at a reunion. At that reunion, when I was being teased, Lisa spoke kindly to me. I invited her for coffee to thank her, and that's where it all began. Over coffee, I became captivated by Lisa's charm and pursued her ardently. Lisa was also drawn to me, and we eventually married. We invited close friends like Steve to our wedding, but Jim was not on the list. We knew inviting him would cause trouble. The wedding was grand, and we enjoyed a very happy time. We later had a son and a daughter. When Lisa, concerned for me, suggested we leave, I said, "I'm fine. There's one more thing I need to do," and signaled to Mike. Jim looked puzzled. Following my signal, Mike and another staff member brought a large cake to the table. Our classmates curiously gathered around the table. I handed a big bouquet to Steve. Steve's eyes widened. "Congratulations on opening your law firm." Steve was clearly surprised, covering his mouth. Jim and the others were equally stunned. "Thank you." I never expected such a celebration. Tears welled up in Steve's eyes. Our classmates erupted in applause. "A law firm? You can't be serious." Jim reacted like a drama protagonist. Steve is a well-known lawyer. After retiring from a major law firm, he fulfilled his dream of opening his own practice. I said, and Jim began to tremble. Steve had worked tirelessly as a student and became a successful lawyer. I felt proud to have Steve as my friend. How could you, the poor ones, accomplish so much? Jim, who thought himself the most capable, was visibly crestfallen. I decided to deliver the final blow. "Jim, you said Summit Enterprises relies on culinary goods? It's actually the other way around. My company brings profit to culinary goods. The president of Culinary Goods pleaded for business with us. Without our partnership, what would happen to Culinary Goods?" Jim turned pale. The room fell silent as everyone watched our exchange with bated breath. That was just something that slipped out. Jim was desperately trying to explain himself. I was too dumbfounded by his sheer shamelessness to respond. "Even at 60, you haven't changed a bit. It's disappointing. We can't do business with a company that looks down on others. Trust is everything in this industry." When I said this, Jim looked at me with pleading eyes. "John, don't say that. We're friends, aren't we? And I don't think of you as poor anymore." "Friends? That's impossible. Are you serious?" "We're not friends. A true friend would never look down on someone like you did to me." With that, I left the reunion with Lisa and Steve. But Jim followed us all the way. "Please. Without the deal with Summit Enterprises, my company will be finished." "That's not my problem." I continued walking, ignoring him. Realizing it was futile, Jim finally walked away, dejected. Once he was gone, Lisa let out a big sigh. "Jim hasn't changed at all. I almost feel sorry for him." "Yeah, but he brought it upon himself." Steve looked tired as well. Then, I made a call to a certain place. A few days later, as I arrived at my office as usual, I saw Jim and his father, Mr. Johnson, the chairman of Culinary Goods, waiting for me at the reception. I glanced at them and headed towards my office. But Mr. Johnson ran after me. "My deepest apologies for my son's behavior. Could you at least hear us out one more time?" Mr. Johnson was desperately pleading with me. I had called him at that time to inform him that we would be terminating all business dealings. I even told him to ask his son for the reason. That's why he was here in a panic. While Mr. Johnson was anxious, Jim's eyes wandered to the pretty receptionist. Why was he even here? It was baffling. "John, please just hear us out. I behaved that way because I thought we were friends." I was speechless. Did he really believe being friends excused his rude behavior? That was a huge misconception. As I've repeatedly said on the phone, my company will no longer do business with Culinary Goods. Hearing this, Mr. Johnson turned to Jim and shouted, "Jim, apologize right now." But Jim showed no intention of apologizing. Even after learning I was the president of Summit Enterprises at the reunion, he hadn't tried to apologize for looking down on me all these years. I didn't expect him to apologize now. Sure enough, Jim said something shocking. "Oh, come on, don't be so uptight. Are you lacking calcium or something?" I couldn't believe he was still saying such things. I then revealed a fact to Mr. Johnson. "Mr. Johnson, I know you're a sincere person. But unfortunately, your son doesn't seem to be." "What? I took a deep breath. Your son has missed several important meetings. He didn't even show up. What? Is that true? Mr. Johnson turned pale. Jim began to break into a cold sweat. You understand how crucial meetings are for business negotiations. If you skip them without any notice, it puts us in a difficult position. Mr. Johnson glared at Jim. Jim, is what Mr. Smith's saying true? Jim's eyes darted around. I didn't skip them on purpose, I just forgot. Hearing this, Mr. Johnson's face turned red with anger. I had already been informed by my sales team about their difficulties dealing with Jim at Culinary Goods. Missing meetings is inexcusable. I've spoiled you too much. I've had enough. You are no longer welcome in my company. It seemed Jim had caused trouble for Mr. Johnson multiple times before. Johnson's resolve was clear, and his expression was stern. Jim looked shocked. Father, are you firing me? Yes. You need to live on your own. You're 60 years old, you should be able to manage. With that, Mr. Johnson apologized deeply to me. I will atone for my son's actions. I've fired him. Please, can we continue our business relationship? I saw a reflection of my past self in the desperate Mr. Johnson. If Jim was no longer involved, I could continue our contract with Culinary Goods. So, I decided to renew our business relationship. Jim, witnessing this, collapsed to the ground. Afterward, Jim was indeed fired from Culinary Goods and kicked out from his home. At 60, finding a new job was tough, so now he lives on a pension. It's ironic considering how much he looked down on pensioners. Through my own life, I've proven that with effort, you can change your destiny. I will continue to live proudly and enjoy the rest of my life.